What do you think is the number one thing people need to focus on in order to be able to find and define the passion that exists within them? Because you were fortunate to have this high level of self-awareness and recognize, hey, what I'm doing, even though I'm receiving rewards, it's not like you were unsuccessful. You weren't at some rock bottom in life saying, clearly this isn't working out. Seems like things were really working out and you were realizing you were unfulfilled. When I work with clients, a lot of times they have that same type of outlook is, hey, my business is succeeding. My income's very high. And maybe they even have a great family life. Like on paper, there's nothing wrong. They might not even necessarily think anything's off kilter, but they're not pursuing purpose and meaning to the fullest extent that they could. And just because we're not doing something as good as it could be done doesn't mean that we have a litany of problems. So for a lot of them that are unaware, what do people need to do in order to become aware, like you did? Hey, there's something higher that I could aim at. And then two, what do they do to craft it and define it and actually aim at it?
Well, I think it starts with the vast majority of people today, I think, are living their lives not on autopilot, but I like to describe it as if they're a pinball in the game of pinball. We are so unintentional about the way we're approaching life that we're like that aimless pinball that just bounces off all the things that we encounter, all the distractions, all the different things that the game players put in our way to keep us from being focused on winning the game. And I think the first thing that a person needs to do is to stop and start allowing yourself to focus on both the short term and what's happening in your life and the longer term outlook of what you've wanted to accomplish with your life. And I think the difficulty in doing that is that life gets very busy. And so it becomes more and more difficult as we get older to have the patience and the discipline to let yourself sit with where your life is now and understand what's working and what's not. And I think there's this thing called self-discrepancy theory, which basically says that we have three versions of ourself. We have our actual self, our ought self, and our ideal self. Our actual self is who we are in this very moment as you and I are talking. Our ought self is who we think we should be. And that's where I think most people end up living their life. And then we have our ideal self, which is who we could become. And our ought self is really dictated by everything from our family upbringing, like my grandparents who were saying to me, you need to be a high achiever. We want you to be a doctor or a lawyer. Or it could be from the friends that you hang out with, or from what you think society is telling you ought to be, or it could be because of your family obligations. You have kids now, and so you feel like you have to take this route, and it becomes harder and harder and harder as we get older to look at that path of becoming our ideal self. And then once you actually realize that difference, it's then coming to terms and allowing yourself to sit with, am I my ought self? Am I living my life as my ideal? What does my ideal really even mean? And so then you have to go through a much deeper exercise of, what is really driving me in life? I mean, what is the end goal? Is the end goal to have a lot of money and a big house? And that's your goal? Is your goal to have as long as a health span as you possibly can with your lifespan? Is it that I want to have strong relationships? So you need to start defining those things. And I think the analogy that I make in the book that you have in front of you is, I use the analogy of a mission angler. So an angler being a fisherman. And when I look at those people who love to fish and who are very good at it, they are extremely focused in doing that discipline, meaning they pick the very early morning hours to go out, because typically where I live in Tampa Bay, they're trying to get 30, 40 miles out. And so they want to get out at a specific time of the day so it's not too hot. They're looking at tides, they're looking at moon phases, all these different things. They're extremely intentional about it. Yet, how many of us are that intentional about our own life and how we're trying to live it? So I think that's what people need to start realizing. And so you're not going to just find this purpose or this passion overnight. It's going to take time, and I think a lot of experimentation to understand what motivates you, what gets you to feel excited, what are those things that you love to do that you can do in a way that's going to help someone else.
Yeah, the difference between the ideal and the ought is sometimes massive. And I notice that a lot of people are very critical of themselves, because this shows up in money conversations all the time. People are very critical of themselves by saying, well, my ought self is different than my actual self. And so when they start describing things that they want to change, or that they're not doing, or that they're doing that they want to stop doing, a lot of times when I ask questions, I start to find out that they're comparing their actual to their ought. And like you said, the ought is what's essentially like prescribed to them based on their interpretation of what other people's values are. You know, the external pressures that we receive from our parents, our community, our neighborhood, our culture, the country we live in can have an influence on what our ought self should be. But then when people identify their ideal self, I find two things. One is sometimes there's a smaller gap between the ideal and the actual than there is between the ought and the actual, which means it's easier to get into alignment than they even thought. Or two, there's often big, massive differences between the ideal and the ought. Sometimes there's alignment. There are things that people want to do that are in both the ideal and the ought. But when people get clear on their ideal, they go, oh, I didn't know I was allowed to do this. Like, I didn't know that I could pursue this. I didn't know that it was okay to prioritize this in my life. And so for some people, for example, like I've talked to clients who realize, you know, I don't have to own a home at all. The idea that I have to own a home and progressively get a nicer home every decade, that was imparted upon me by others. That's not a value of mine. I don't have to do that. I want to not have a home. That way I can ideally move around and explore different areas of the country because I work remote and I don't need to be in one spot. Oh, wow, that's great. If you would prioritize upgrading the kitchen every 3 years, we would have sacrificed this ideal.
Yeah, I think we get wedded down in our minds, maybe by what our parents have or what we see other people have as being this vision of what we ourselves have to accomplish. And I think the older I've gotten, the less I see the need in having these huge monetary things, because all they do is bring you more burdens. And I have been trying over time to simplify my life as I get older, not make it more complex. But I think each person is wired so differently, to your point, that a lot of times we just fall in this trap of wanting to accumulate more and more and more. Yeah. And I have found all that has brought me is discontent instead of fulfillment.
Well, what do you think is the key to identifying that ideal self? Because I haven't necessarily figured out what the key is, and a lot of my clients struggle with it, but identifying the key, the ideal self, painting a very clear picture, what do we need to do in order to get there?
So generally, there are three things that we as humans need to have to feel that we have fulfillment. One is we need to feel relatedness, meaning we need to have strong relationships with other people that give us a sense of purpose and meaning. We need to have autonomy, meaning We need to feel that we have a choice and we willingly endorse our own behavior. The opposite of that is feeling compelled or controlled. And then we need to have competence, which is a feeling of mastery over something in our life where we're highly effective in doing an activity. And these are the three things that when you look at blue zones across the world, that the people who have lived the longest, they have these three major buckets that define their life. So autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And it just turns out that two scientists, Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, discovered this and termed it self-determination theory. And I think that it is these three components and looking at what you ideally would like your life to be like, and then how do you basically build that with these three things in it. So how do you create a life with personal agency so that you are directing it in the way that you want it? What are the competencies that if you want to achieve that, you need to master in this life plan? And then what are the relationships that you need to have in your life to give you that foundation over which those two things can sit upon, is how I would approach it.
That makes sense.